In the farthest reaches of the Scottish Highlands, where the fog seemed eternal and the mountains stood like jagged teeth against the sky, there existed a valley so remote that maps seldom marked it, and travelers who stumbled upon it by mistake spoke no more of it afterward, not because they forgot, but because memory itself seemed poisoned by the place. And in the heart of this valley rose the Abbey of Saint Cairn, a monstrous structure of blackened stone built on the ruins of something older and far less holy, with towers that pierced the mist and walls that absorbed light rather than reflected it, so that to look at it, even from a distance, was to feel the weight of centuries pressing down on your chest. The villagers of the hamlets nearby avoided even speaking its name aloud, whispering only that the abbey had not been built to glorify God, but to contain something that should never see the sky again. And their fear was so rooted that they would leave offerings of bread and salt at the broken bridge leading toward the valley, but never dared to cross it. For at night, when the moon was hidden and the peat bogs shone faintly with ghost lights, a figure was said to walk the ruined cloisters of Saint Cairn. A figure tall and gaunt, draped in robes the color of ash, its hood forever lowered so that its face was never seen, though some swore that in the hollows of that hood burned faint embers like dying coals. And the few who returned from catching even a glimpse of the figure could speak only in broken voices of a presence so wrong, so heavy, that it stripped them of sleep forevermore. The legend of this being grew until it was known in whispers as the Ashen Friar, a name that curdled the tongue, a name that no one dared to say twice in the same breath. Yet history, or what little of it could be pieced together from charred manuscripts and forbidden sermons, told a darker tale, that in the year of plague 1647, a man was brought in chains to Saint Cairn by order of the Archbishop himself, though no record exists of his crime, only that his punishment was not death, but confinement without end, and that a hood was fashioned of woven cinders and consecrated iron, nailed to his flesh so that no eye might ever behold what lay beneath. He was said to have been a scholar, a friar too curious for the Church's liking, one who unearthed texts older than the Gospels and spoke names that bent the air itself, names that even demons feared. And for that he was silenced, yet not destroyed, for reasons no one dared to write. From the moment he was sealed away, the Abbey of Saint Cairn changed. Its bells no longer rang for prayer, but tolled at midnight of their own accord. The stone grew cold to the touch even in summer, and the monks who lived within whispered that their cloisters echoed with footsteps not their own, with prayers uttered backward, with whispers rising through the cracks in the floor as if from some pit beneath. The villagers told each other that whenever the wind howled through the valley, one could hear beneath it the faint chant of a single voice, droning endlessly, not Latin, not Gaelic, but a tongue that clawed at the ears and left one trembling without knowing why. A few hunters who dared the forest near the abbey spoke of seeing the friar standing among the trees, motionless, watching, and though the hood obscured his face, they claimed to feel the sear of unseen eyes burning through the mist. When questioned, these men would fall into silence, their jaws clenching as though words themselves would betray them, and more than one took to drink until their livers failed, for sobriety brought only the friar's memory back with sharper teeth. Within the abbey itself, records survive only through fragmented letters smuggled to other monasteries, letters warning of brothers vanishing in the night, of novices sent to clean the northern cloister never returning, of strange marks carved into the chapel doors resembling eyes with no pupils. And though the abbot forbade any mention of the Ashen Friar, the fear could not be silenced, for every man within those walls knew that there was something behind the hood, something sealed yet seeping, like smoke through cracks, and that each day the prayers grew weaker, while the whisper beneath the stones grew stronger. It was said that one night Brother Callum, driven by both terror and fascination, crept toward the sealed cell where the friar was kept, and pressed his ear against the iron-bound door, only to hear his own name whispered back to him in a voice like burning wood, a voice that begged not for freedom, but for witness. And though Callum fled screaming, his hair turned white before dawn, and he was found wandering the bogs days later, raving that he had looked into the hood and seen not a face, but a void glowing red, a furnace of silence that wished only to devour. And after that night, the abbot ordered all doors to the northern wing bricked shut, and a decree was issued that no brother should ever approach it again. But decrees cannot stop dreams, and the younger monks began to dream of the friar walking through their dormitory at night, the weight of ash falling from his robes, leaving trails on the floor like footprints of soot, and each man swore he alone had dreamed it, though when they awoke, the trails were still there, black against the stone. In time, some monks begged to be transferred. Others succumbed to madness, scratching the same phrase into the walls until their fingers bled. The fire is not quenched, the fire waits. And though outsiders dismissed these tales as superstition, the villagers grew certain that the abbey was less a house of God than a cage, and that the Ashen Friar was not a prisoner, but a fire contained only by the thinnest veil of stone and prayer. And already that veil was thinning, for in the winter of 1672, when snow buried the valley and wolves came down from the mountains, a storm tore away part of the abbey roof, and the villagers swore they saw a light glowing in the northern tower, a light not of flame, but of burning eyes. And the tolling of the bells that night was heard as far as the coast, though no hand touched the ropes, and in the silence that followed, all who lived in the valley agreed on one thing: the Ashen Friar was awake.
The winter after the storm that tore the roof of Saint Cairn's Abbey marked the beginning of what the villagers came to call the season of ash, for even when snow fell endlessly from the sky, black dust gathered on their window sills, clung to their clothes, and drifted from the direction of the abbey like smoke from an unseen fire, though no fire was ever seen, and the priests in the neighboring parishes declared it a natural phenomenon, though their eyes betrayed doubt, for they too had begun to dream of a hooded figure standing by their beds, whispering in a tongue that left them drenched in sweat. It was during this time that rumors began to spread more quickly than the frost. Stories of cattle found dead with their mouths filled with soot, of children born with blackened fingernails, of wells that ran bitter as if the water had turned to ash, and each tale ended the same way, with villagers swearing they had heard bells tolling from the abbey at midnight, though the snow choked every path leading to it, leaving no trace of human travel. In the taverns of the nearby hamlets, the old men whispered of a curse laid upon the land centuries before, when druids burned upon that very ground had cried out to the sky that their fire would outlast Rome, and some said the Ashen Friar was no friar at all, but a remnant of that pagan fire, bound in human form to smolder until the day he was freed. Yet others claimed that he had been a scholar who read a book never meant to be written, a book that contained words not invented but remembered, and that the hood was nailed to him to prevent those words from leaving his lips. The monks inside Saint Cairn, those few whose letters were smuggled beyond the valley, told a darker tale still, of shadows moving along the cloisters without source, of statues weeping a resin that burned the skin, of voices rising from beneath the chapel floor as though a congregation worshipped in the crypts, chanting not to Christ but to something older. One letter, penned in a trembling hand by Brother Malachi, spoke of hearing his own prayers repeated in perfect unison by another voice, though he prayed alone. And when he stopped, the voice continued without him, until silence broke his courage and he fled, only to find black soot on his tongue as though he had been speaking still. Malachi vanished days later, officially transferred to another abbey, but the monks who remained swore his cell door slammed each night at the stroke of midnight, and his shadow lingered on its wall, even when the room was empty. The abbot forbade any discussion of the friar, insisting the hooded prisoner was nothing but a test of faith. Yet his eyes betrayed the terror of a man who knew his prayers no longer reached heaven, for the air in the northern wing grew colder each day, and those who passed near the sealed doors returned pale and sickly, some with burns across their hands as though they had touched hot iron, though they swore they had touched nothing. Whispers spread that the hood was loosening, that nails once hammered into flesh had begun to rust, and that what was contained might soon speak freely, for one novice confessed in tears that he had heard words inside his head while scrubbing the chapel floors, words that made no sense yet echoed in him until he bled from his nose and collapsed. And when the abbot pressed him for what the voice had said, the boy gasped out only 3 words before ceasing: "The fire waits." The villagers meanwhile grew restless, for famine had struck the valley, blight rotting their crops before harvest, and some whispered that the Ashen Friar was feeding on their suffering, that as long as he remained shackled the land itself would starve, and so a faction of desperate men gathered at the edge of the bog to debate whether to storm the abbey and drag the hooded figure into the river. But none dared, for each time they drew near the bells tolled by themselves, and the ground shook as though warning them back. One night, however, a drunk shepherd named Ewan, mocked by his peers for his cowardice, boasted that he would do what no one else dared, and set off alone towards Saint Cairn armed with nothing but a torch. The next morning the villagers found the torch smoldering in the mud at the valley's edge, and beside it a blackened trail of footprints that led not back to the village, but toward their cottages, ending at Ewan's own doorstep, where he was found sitting upright in his chair, his eyes charred into black hollows, his mouth filled with ash. No villager crossed the bog again, but they began to hear him at night, his voice calling from the mist, repeating the prayers of the living in tones that cracked and hissed like burning wood. Inside the abbey, the monks were breaking, some abandoning their vows and fleeing into the wilderness where wolves waited, others driven to self-flagellation in hopes of purging the taint they felt in their blood, and still others succumbing to whispers only they could hear, whispers that drew them toward the bricked northern wing. Brother Alasdair, once a quiet man of study, was found at dawn clawing the mortar from those sealed doors with his bare hands, his fingers worn to bone, muttering over and over, "He is cold, he is cold, let him breathe," until they dragged him away. The abbot declared him possessed and ordered him confined, but the monks knew possession was not the word, for in Alasdair's eyes they saw only longing, the longing of a moth for flame. In the months that followed, the abbey became less a monastery than a tomb, with chants that once lifted hearts now sounding like dirges, and each night more monks claimed to hear footsteps pacing the cloisters, slow and deliberate, ash falling in their wake, until at last the abbot himself confessed to his closest advisers that the Ashen Friar had begun to walk, that the hood no longer bound him to his cell, and that chains forged by men could not hold what burned within. Yet no one dared to write those words, and so history would only remember silence, while the villagers kept their children inside at dusk and prayed not to God, but to anything that might keep the bells from tolling again. For they knew that with each toll the hood loosened, and the friar's fire pressed closer to the world.
By the year 1675, Saint Cairn's Abbey was no longer spoken of even in whispers beyond the valley, for too many travelers who attempted to pass near its grounds had vanished without trace, and the few whose corpses were recovered were found blackened as though from smoke, though their clothes bore no scorch, and their mouths were filled with a dry gray powder that crumbled like old parchment. The villagers came to believe that to speak the friar's name was to invite him into one's dreams, and so they taught their children to avoid it. Yet children whispered it nonetheless, daring each other in the dark to say it 3 times, and more than once a boy who took the dare woke the next day pale and hollow-eyed, unable to speak above a rasp, muttering only that he was listening. And so fear tightened its grip until silence itself became the only prayer. Within the abbey walls, the brothers fared no better, for the abbot's decrees grew harsher with every month, punishing even the slightest mention of the northern wing with exile or confinement. Yet repression only fanned the flames of curiosity, and several novices began to secretly record what they witnessed in journals hidden beneath their mattresses, though most were later burned upon discovery, leaving only fragments which speak of shadows too tall to be cast by men, of doors slamming in empty corridors, of a smell like burnt wool lingering in the chapel after midnight prayers, and most of all, of a voice that seemed to echo within their own heads, calling them not by their Christian names, but by names they did not know they carried, names that tasted of smoke and iron when they tried to repeat them. One such novice, Brother Ayin, confessed to another that he had dreamt of the friar standing before the altar, hood lifted just enough to reveal not a face, but a hollow furnace glowing with ember light, and that from the hollow came whispers not of temptation, but of knowledge that promised answers to every question he had ever dared not ask. And though his confessor begged him to forget, within days Brother Ayin was gone, his bed unslept in, his shoes left behind at the door of the northern wing, and the abbot declared him transferred, though none believed it, for they all heard his voice during Vespers a week later, chanting in a language none could understand, rising from the sealed cloister where no man had stood for decades. That same winter, the friary's library suffered a mysterious fire that consumed only 3 shelves, yet left untouched the rest of the room, and among the ash was found a single intact volume bound in cracked leather, its title scrawled in an alphabet no monk recognized, but the abbot ordered it hidden in the sacristy, claiming it was temptation sent by the enemy, though several brothers swore they saw him reading it by candlelight deep into the night, his lips moving as if repeating words best left unsaid. Those who glimpsed the pages through a half-open door later reported that the text seemed to shift, the letters reshaping when unobserved, and that the drawings depicted figures kneeling before a hooded man with no face, their bodies burning, yet their expressions rapturous. Whispers spread that the book had not survived the fire by accident, but had been preserved by the friar himself, for the ash found in its pages matched the ash that drifted from the northern wing each morning. As fear deepened, monks began abandoning the abbey altogether, leaving in the night with nothing but a cloak, but few were ever seen again, and those who returned were unrecognizable, their hair gone white, their eyes filmed over, their voices raw from endless chanting of a single phrase, "The fire is not quenched." The villagers, too, witnessed strange phenomena. Flocks of crows circling the abbey at dawn, the river running black for 3 days, though no source of silt could be found, statues in their parish church cracking down the middle, each fissure shaped like a hooded silhouette, and they came to believe the friar's influence was no longer contained within the abbey, but was spreading outward, suffusing the valley like smoke seeps through stone. Desperate, a group of elders traveled to the bishop at Inverness to beg for intervention, and though the bishop listened gravely, when he returned with a small retinue of priests, he refused to set foot across the broken bridge, declaring that what lay within was under papal seal and not to be disturbed, that Saint Cairn's Abbey was not to be touched by mortal hands, and with those words he departed, leaving the valley to its fate. This silence from the church only deepened suspicion, for the monks whispered that the friar had not been condemned by Rome, but placed there by it, that he was less a sinner than a weapon too dangerous to unleash, yet too useful to destroy, a vessel for knowledge that even the Vatican feared but could not bear to lose, and so he was chained, hooded, silenced, waiting.
In the spring of that year, thunder split the skies above the abbey, though no storm was seen, and the bells rang without hands once more, their sound not of bronze, but of cracking stone, and those who dared listen swore the toll carried words, syllables that rearranged themselves inside the listener's skull until meaning bloomed like fire. When the hood falls, the valley burns. And as that warning or promise echoed through the glen, the villagers fled their fields, abandoning their homes to the wolves and bog. Yet even as they ran, they knew escape was folly, for already their dreams were marked by ash. Already the friar walked the corridors of their sleep, and already they carried the fire with them wherever they went.
By the late 1670s, the Abbey of Saint Cairn had become less a monastery than a mausoleum, a hollow place where prayers no longer rose, but fell like stones into a pit. And though outwardly the walls still stood unbroken, within them the brothers were unraveling one by one, for the Ashen Friar no longer lingered only in whispers or dreams, but in the waking hours, his presence pressing against the skin like heat from a fire too close, and no man could walk the cloisters without feeling watched. Some monks swore they saw him standing at the far end of a corridor, tall and hooded, ash sifting from his sleeves, yet when they approached, the figure vanished, leaving only footprints of soot. And these sightings became so common that the abbot stopped punishing those who spoke of them, for silence could no longer suppress what the eye itself betrayed. Worse still were the voices rising from beneath the floor of the chapel, not cries of torment, but the low hum of chant, 100 strong, as if an unseen congregation gathered below the stones, repeating a litany that none could translate, yet all recognized in their marrow, a litany that promised fire not as punishment, but as salvation. One evening, Brother Fergus, a man of great learning, announced to his fellows that he had at last deciphered part of the hidden text recovered from the library fire. And though the abbot forbade him to speak further, he whispered in secret that the friar was once known as Adon, a scholar from Ireland who had unearthed fragments of the Druids' last scripture, words that claimed fire was not merely destruction, but the true language of creation, a tongue older than man, and that by speaking it one might reshape the world. Adon, it was said, had read those words aloud, and the air itself had bent, the stones had wept, and his brothers had bound him lest his lips utter them again, covering his face with the hood woven from ash and iron nails, sealing him into the northern wing as both prisoner and sacrifice. Fergus vanished the night after his confession, and the next day soot streaks in the shape of words were found on the chapel wall, a single phrase repeated again and again until the mortar cracked. "Let him speak." Meanwhile, in the villages the famine worsened. Livestock dropped dead with no wound, fields yielded only husks, and children were born silent, their mouths opening in cries that produced no sound. And though the priests urged faith, the people began to murmur that their salvation lay not in Rome, but in freeing the Ashen Friar. For if he commanded fire, then perhaps he could burn away their misery. And so a small group of desperate men crossed the broken bridge one storm-swept night, armed with axes and ropes, determined to storm the abbey and tear down the sealed wall. What happened within was never fully known, but the next morning the monks awoke to find the doors to the chapel blown outward, blackened handprints smeared across the stone, and in the courtyard 6 figures stood frozen like statues. The intruders turned to brittle husks of ash that crumbled at the touch of wind, their mouths stretched wide as though screaming even in death. The abbot declared it a sign of divine wrath and ordered the remains buried.
But the villagers who dared come near whispered that the men had not died in pain, but in rapture, their expressions more ecstatic than terrified. And from that day, the idea of the friar as a demon weakened, while the notion of him as a prophet grew. Inside the abbey, monks began to divide. Some clung to silence in fear, insisting the hood was a curse to be borne until death, while others believed that the church had lied, that Adon had not been imprisoned for sin, but for knowledge, and that the hood was not to protect them from him, but to protect Rome from the truth he carried. This schism grew sharper with each passing night, until whispers turned to arguments, arguments to blows, and blood was spilled on the cloister stones for the first time since the abbey's founding. The abbot, aged and trembling, retreated into solitude, leaving leadership fractured, and in his absence certain brothers dared the unthinkable. They slipped into the bricked wing under cover of darkness, chiseling away at the mortar, driven not by courage but by compulsion. And those who returned carried eyes blackened around the rims as though charred, speaking softly of warmth, of comfort, of voices promising that the world need not suffer cold and hunger if only they would allow the fire to rise. Their words spread like plague, and soon novices gathered in secret to recite strange prayers, not to Christ, but to the hooded figure, begging not for deliverance from sin, but for ignition, until the abbey itself became a tinderbox of divided faith. In this crucible of fear, Brother Duncan wrote a final testament, hidden in the hollow of a chapel pew, in which he confessed that he had seen beneath the hood, not with his eyes, but in a dream so vivid it left burns upon his face when he awoke, and what he saw was not flesh, not bone, but a hollow furnace glowing red, as if the man's head was gone, and in its place a crucible that consumed light itself. Duncan warned that the hood was no mere punishment, but a seal, and that if it fell, the valley would not merely burn, but become a mouth through which something far older would speak. Within weeks, Duncan was gone, his testament discovered only after the abbey collapsed into chaos. For that spring, the bells rang without end for 3 days and 3 nights, their sound carrying words none dared repeat. And at the close of the 3rd night, the villagers saw from their windows a glow rising from the abbey towers, not the glow of fire, but of ember eyes watching across the valley. And though no blaze consumed the walls, soot reigned for miles, as though the sky itself had turned to ash. When dawn broke, the abbot emerged at last, pale as death, his hair turned white, and declared to the surviving monks that the Ashen Friar no longer waited, he walked, and that only silence and obedience might delay what was to come, though even as he spoke his hands shook and his eyes darted to the northern wing, where faint heat shimmered like air above a furnace, betraying the truth all already knew. The hood was failing, and the fire beneath was straining to speak.
By 1681, the valley of Saint Cairn had become a place outsiders avoided, not only out of fear, but out of instinct. For travelers spoke of the air growing heavy long before the abbey came into sight, of birds falling dead mid-flight, of silence so complete it felt like the world itself held its breath. And though the few who crossed the broken bridge swore the abbey still stood intact, the villagers no longer called it an abbey, but a tomb, a furnace sealed by stone. Their lives had withered as though the land itself was cursed, the fields lying barren, the river filling their mouths with bitterness, children born with still lungs, and each misfortune was blamed on the hooded figure who had ceased to be legend and become certainty. For sightings of the Ashen Friar multiplied, no longer bound to cloisters or shadows, but walking openly through the forests at dusk, his tall frame veiled in smoke,
his hood glowing faintly as if embers burned beneath it, and always ash drifting from his robes in trails that lingered long after he passed. Shepherds swore their flocks scattered before him, though he made no sound. Hunters fled the trees upon glimpsing him standing motionless among the trunks, and even within cottages, villagers woke to find soot upon their thresholds, shaped like footprints pointing inward. Some began to say he was no prisoner at all, but a sentinel, striding the land freely, while the monks still deceived themselves with walls. And the fear that once silenced tongues now erupted into hysteria, with whole families fleeing in the night, though none who left were ever seen again, as if the valley itself swallowed them into its soil. The church could no longer ignore the tales, for letters smuggled from the abbey reached Rome describing phenomena too grave to dismiss: statues weeping black resin, crucifixes splitting, monks collapsing into trances muttering syllables unfit for human mouths. And so in the autumn of that year a bishop arrived with 12 priests, armed not with swords but with relics, intent to cleanse the abbey and either banish or destroy what lay within. The villagers gathered to watch from the hills as the bishop crossed the bridge, chanting psalms. Yet the moment his foot touched the valley's soil, a wind rose so fierce it bent trees flat. The sky darkened, and the bells of the abbey tolled, though no rope swung, each strike sending a vibration through the bones of all who heard, as if the very earth resonated. Undaunted, the bishop pressed forward, entering the abbey with his priests, but what transpired within was never recorded in any official chronicle, for when the doors burst open hours later, only 3 priests stumbled out, their eyes burned black, their tongues shriveled, and when they tried to speak, it was not in words, but in the sound of crackling fire. The bishop himself was never seen again, though on the 3rd night after his disappearance, the monks awoke to find his mitre placed upon the altar of the chapel, blackened and filled with ash. From that moment, the monks knew no outside salvation would come, and the schism among them deepened into war, some clinging to their vows and sealing themselves in prayer, others proclaiming openly that the Ashen Friar was the true light, the hidden flame sent to consume corruption, and that only by removing the hood could the valley be reborn. These heretics gathered secretly, chanting before the bricked northern wing, pressing their ears to the cold stone as though to hear the breath of the prisoner. And some returned with faces blistered, their skin peeling as though burned from within, yet smiling through their agony, declaring that he had spoken to them, promising them warmth when the world froze, fire when faith faltered. Soon hallucinations spread beyond the abbey, villagers waking with mouths full of ash, mothers cradling infants who whispered in voices not their own, flocks of crows falling dead from the sky, yet standing again at dusk to peck at the chapel windows. And all the while the friar's presence seeped outward, felt in every shadow, every silence, every flame that guttered and refused to die. One storm-lashed night, Brother Ammon, half mad with hunger and grief, stole into the sacristy and seized the forbidden book saved from the library fire, intent to burn it at last. But as he laid it upon the coals, it did not catch, instead opening of its own accord, its pages glowing red like steel in a forge, and from within rose not smoke but ash, ash that curled into letters in the air spelling words none could read, and Ammon screamed until his throat tore, for the letters branded themselves upon his skin, leaving him writhing upon the floor while the book sealed itself shut again. He lingered for 3 days, chanting in a voice that grew deeper by the hour until he finally expired, his corpse crumbling into powder that sifted across the stones until no trace remained. The abbot, broken, declared to the monks that they no longer guarded a man, but a furnace of creation, and that Rome had known it all along. placing them not as jailers but as sacrifices, a living seal whose prayers and flesh kept the hood bound, but whose failure would mean not only the valley, but the world itself would ignite. Yet his words fell hollow, for already the hood's seams were loosening, rust flaking from the nails, and each night more ash poured through the cracks in the northern wall, drifting like snow through the abbey until it blanketed the cloisters. One novice, trembling with fever, confessed that he had seen the hood in his dreams split for an instant, and beneath it was not a face, but a sun. A black sun burning inward, pulling light into itself, and that when he awoke his eyes bled as though scorched. Others too began to dream the same dream until it was no longer private but communal, as if the friar wove their minds together into a single vision, a vision of fire swallowing stone, of words spoken that cracked the sky, of silence broken by a roar older than the world. By winter's end, the valley was no longer merely cursed, but marked, a place where the air itself seemed to breathe, where wolves prowled unafraid into villages, where the stars vanished each night behind a shroud of soot, and all, including the friar, knew that the hood would not hold much longer, that the seal was failing, and that whatever voice lay beneath was ready, at last, to speak.
The year 1683 marked the final winter of Saint Cairn's Abbey, though no chronicle recorded its fall and no church authority ever spoke its name again, for what transpired was too vast, too consuming to be bound by ink and parchment. By then the hood that had sealed the Ashen Friar for more than 3 decades was visibly failing, its nails rusted to flakes, its seams glowing faintly as if embers pressed from within, and each night more ash drifted into the cloisters until it coated the floors ankle-deep, leaving black trails wherever the monks walked, and some swore the ash writhed faintly as though breathing. Prayers had become impossible, for whenever the brothers gathered in the chapel, their chants dissolved into coughing fits, their throats filling with soot, until what rose from their mouths was no longer hymn, but rasping whispers that echoed the friar's name, though none meant to speak it. The abbot, skeletal with age and terror, confessed to his remaining faithful that he dreamt nightly of a voice calling him into the northern wing, a voice promising him absolution if only he removed the hood. And he begged them to restrain him, lest he fall to temptation, but restraint proved futile when half the abbey had already embraced the figure as Messiah, not monster, and when at last those zealots rose in the night to tear down the bricked wall, the faithful resisted, and thus the abbey dissolved into war. Monks striking monks, blood spilling on stone, all beneath the tolling of bells that swung themselves, their sound like thunder rolling through the bones of the valley. As the factions clashed, the wall gave way not by hand, but by force from within, stones bursting outward in a storm of ash, and there, framed in the breach, stood the Ashen Friar, taller than any remembered, his hood glowing from within as though a furnace blazed behind it, his robes trailing soot that hissed as it touched the ground. Silence fell upon the abbey as both zealot and loyalist beheld him, and for a moment all were united in awe, until he lifted his head, and the hood split, the nails snapping, the seams tearing, and what lay beneath was revealed. Not a face, not flesh, but a void of burning light, a hollow sun black at its core, radiating heat so intense the air wavered, yet drawing light inward, so that candles died, torches sputtered, and eyes bled from trying to comprehend. Some monks fell to their knees weeping in ecstasy, stretching their arms toward the fire, their skin blistering as if scorched from within, while others clawed their own eyes to escape the sight, and still others fled screaming into the night only to collapse as ash consumed them, leaving their bodies hollow as husks. The abbot, trembling, lifted a crucifix and cried out the last prayer his failing voice could muster, but the friar turned toward him and whispered a single word in a tongue no man had spoken for millennia,
And at that word the crucifix split, as though struck by lightning, its metal drooping like wax, and the abbot fell dead, his chest hollowed, as if fire had eaten him from within. Outside, the valley itself convulsed, the river boiled, forests ignited though no flame touched them, wolves howled in chorus before falling silent, and the sky split with cracks of red light, as if dawn had broken at midnight. Villagers who fled stumbled blind through snow now blackened with cinder, some swearing they saw the Ashen Friar striding across the hills, his hoodless void burning so brightly it lit the clouds, his voice carried on the wind not as words but as thunder, syllables that shook bones and split earth. Within the abbey, the last faithful gathered what relics they could and hurled themselves at him in a final act of sacrifice, but each man who touched him was consumed in an instant, their bodies collapsing into drifting soot that joined the storm swirling around him, until the abbey itself trembled, its walls splitting, towers collapsing, the very stones glowing as if placed within a furnace. And with a roar that seemed to come not from his mouth, but from the earth itself, the friar cast off the hood entirely, its remnants disintegrating into sparks, and proclaimed in a voice that reverberated through marrow, "The fire is unbound." The ground opened beneath him, swallowing a northern wing into a furnace chasm, flames pouring upward not in tongues of red, but in streams of black light that devoured rather than illuminated. And all who remained were drawn toward it, monks and villagers alike, dragged screaming into the abyss, their cries fading into silence as if consumed by an eternal wind. By dawn, nothing of the abbey remained but a crater, its stones melted, its towers vanished, its chapel reduced to slag. And above the crater hung a haze of ash that never dispersed, a cloud so dense no sunlight pierced it. And those few outsiders who dared approach in later years found the valley barren, its soil poisoned, its trees skeletal, its river a ribbon of black sludge. And though they camped far from the crater, they swore that on nights of storm a glow still rose from its depths, pulsing like breath, and bells tolled faintly, though no abbey remained to house them. As for the Ashen Friar, none could say if he had perished in the collapse, or if he had been freed to walk the earth, for travelers whispered of hooded figures glimpsed on distant roads, their robes trailing soot, their presence leaving fields dead in their wake, and dreams shared across villages miles apart, dreams of a hollow sun burning behind a hood, whispering in a voice like crackling timber that the fire was not quenched, only waiting. Centuries later, in forgotten archives of Rome, a manuscript surfaced, bearing no name, its author long dead, yet within its brittle pages was written in trembling hand, "He was no man but a mouth, no friar but a furnace, sealed not to protect us from him, but to protect the world from what spoke through him. And when the hood fell, the fire awoke, and it will not sleep again." Thus ended the tale of Saint Cairn's Abbey, swallowed by its own silence, remembered only in whispers and ash, a warning that fire may be chained but never quenched, and that some names, once spoken, burn forever.